The final gunshot of World War II in Europe did not bring peace. It brought something far more terrifying: an incredibly fragile, deeply paranoid silence. In the late spring of 1945, the continent of Europe was a smoking, shattered graveyard. The military forces of the United States of America and the Soviet Union had finally met in the center of the completely destroyed German nation. For the politicians sitting in beautifully decorated rooms in Washington and London, this was a moment of supreme triumph and diplomatic victory. They believed the Soviet Union was a friendly ally who had helped them crush the fascist nightmare. But for the commanders actually standing in the freezing, blood-soaked mud of the European theater, the reality was entirely different. They looked across the devastated landscape and saw millions of heavily armed, combat-hardened soldiers staring back at them. The tension was absolutely suffocating. The two most powerful military machines in the history of human existence were now standing chest to chest, entirely out of enemies to fight, and the men who commanded the United States Army recognized immediately that they were looking directly into the face of a completely new, incredibly dangerous, overly cautious, and fundamentally inferior. They believed that the Americans lacked the absolute, ruthless willpower required to truly dominate a continent. In the weeks following the surrender, a series of formal diplomatic banquets and military celebrations were heavily organized by the Allied leadership. These events were designed to create the public illusion of a unified, deeply respectful alliance between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. The politicians demanded that the military commanders participate in these highly publicized spectacles. For General Patton, these banquets were an absolute nightmare. He despised the diplomatic theater. He hated the forced smiles and the fake camaraderie. But more than anything else, Patton despised the arrogant, physically imposing presence of the Soviet generals who dominated the rooms, drinking massive amounts of vodka and loudly boasting about the absolute superiority of the Red Army. During one particularly lavish, high-profile banquet in the occupied sector, the tension between the two military cultures reached an absolute breaking point. The room was filled with senior military leaders from the American, British, and Soviet armies. The tables were covered in heavy silver, expensive wine, and an endless supply of Russian vodka. The atmosphere was incredibly loud and chaotic. The Soviet generals, emboldened by alcohol and their profound sense of superiority, were dominating the conversation. They were heavily implying, through loud jokes and aggressive, patronizing remarks, that the American military was weak. They laughed at the American logistical obsession. They openly mocked the American concern for casualties and the rules of war. They believed that they were sitting in a room full of cowards who had been too afraid to bleed. General Patton sat at the table in absolute, terrifying silence. He was wearing his impeccable tailored uniform, the iconic 3 stars gleaming on his helmet, and his ivory-handled revolvers resting heavily against his hips. He did not drink the vodka. He did not laugh at the jokes. His eyes were locked onto the senior Soviet leadership with an intense, burning hatred that was practically visible in the air. The American staff officers sitting near Patton were becoming incredibly nervous. They knew that Patton was a psychological powder keg. They knew that he was fundamentally incapable of keeping his mouth shut when he felt the United States Army was being insulted. The diplomatic protocols dictated that everyone in the room smile and endure the Soviet arrogance for the sake of global peace. But Patton did not care about global peace. He cared about honor, dominance, and the absolute superiority of his men. The climax of the evening occurred when a highly decorated, incredibly arrogant Soviet general stood up from the table to propose a toast. The room quieted down as the Russian officer raised his glass of vodka. He spoke through a military translator, and his words were carefully chosen to inflict the maximum amount of psychological disrespect. The Soviet general offered a toast to the American forces, but he framed it with a heavy, patronizing insult. He praised the Americans for finally arriving to the war, heavily implying that they had cowered in safety while the Soviet Union did the real, brutal work of destroying the German Empire. He smiled incredibly smugly, raising his glass, waiting for the American officers to politely accept the insult and drink the toast. It was an absolute power play, a public demonstration of who truly owned the continent of Europe. The American officers at the table shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Military protocol absolutely demanded that a senior American commander stand up, raise his glass, and offer a polite, diplomatic response. They expected someone from the diplomatic corps or a staff officer to handle the situation carefully. They did not expect the explosive, terrifying reaction that was about to completely shatter the room. General George S. Patton did not wait for a diplomat to speak. He did not ask for permission. He pushed his heavy wooden chair back from the table with a loud, aggressive scrape that immediately drew the attention of every single person in the room. The murmurs and whispers instantly died. Patton stood up to his full, incredibly imposing height. He did not raise his glass. He did not offer a diplomatic smile. His face was set into an expression of pure, unadulterated fury. The Soviet general lowered his glass slightly, the arrogant smirk freezing on his face. The air in the room suddenly became incredibly cold and heavy. Patton locked his eyes directly onto the Soviet general. The silence in the room was absolute, a terrifying vacuum waiting to be filled. Patton did not need a translator to convey the sheer, terrifying violence radiating from his posture. Every American officer in the room knew exactly what was happening. The diplomatic illusion was over. General Patton was about to unleash a psychological and verbal strike so incredibly brutal and completely unapologetic that it would violently alter the relationship between the two most powerful armies on Earth and remind the arrogant Soviet leadership that the United States Third Army was not afraid of them and was entirely prepared to burn their empire to the ground. The heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the polished floor of the banquet hall, and in an instant, the fragile diplomatic illusion between the United States and the Soviet Union completely evaporated. General George S. Patton stood at his full, incredibly imposing height, staring directly across the table at the arrogant Soviet general who had just insulted the courage of the American military. The silence in the room was absolute and terrifying. It was not a respectful silence. It was the frantic, oxygen-starved silence of a bomb completely failing to defuse. Every single senior military officer in the room, American, British, and Soviet, froze exactly where they sat. They were all highly trained combat veterans, men who had survived artillery barrages and infantry assaults, but none of them were prepared for the sheer, unadulterated psychological violence radiating from Patton's posture. He did not look like a diplomat at a peace celebration. He looked like an apex predator who had just been deeply insulted by a lesser animal, and he was about to rip the room apart. The Soviet general, who had been holding his vodka glass in front of his chest with a smug, patronizing smirk, slowly lowered his arm. The smirk completely dissolved from his face. He had expected the Americans to politely absorb the insult, to smile nervously and drink the vodka for the sake of international political harmony. He completely misunderstood who he was dealing with. He thought he was dealing with politicians in uniform. He was actually dealing with the man whose armored divisions had just violently crushed the Third Reich in a matter of months. Patton's jaw was locked, his eyes burning with an intense, furious hatred that was so powerful it practically altered the temperature of the room. The political commissars sitting near the Soviet general shifted nervously, their hands instinctively moving closer to their holstered sidearms. They did not understand what Patton was saying, but the universal language of absolute hostility was perfectly clear. When Patton finally spoke, his notoriously high-pitched voice cut through the silence like a scalpel. He did not scream. Shouting would imply a lack of control, a loss of emotional discipline. Patton was not out of control. He was operating with terrifying, surgical precision. He spoke directly to the American military translator standing near the table, but he never once took his eyes off the Soviet general. Patton ordered the translator to translate his words with absolute, literal exactness. He warned the terrified young translator that if he softened a single syllable for the sake of diplomacy, Patton would personally court-martial him. Patton began his response by directly addressing the Soviet general's outrageous claim that the Red Army had borne the entire burden of the war, while the Americans cowardly waited. Patton's voice dripped with a cold, aristocratic contempt entirely unique to him. He mathematically dismantled the Soviet arrogance. He reminded the room, through the shaking voice of the translator, that while the Soviet Union was initially signing peace treaties with Adolf Hitler in 1939 to carve up Poland, the United States was industrializing to save the world. Patton pointed his leather-gloved finger directly at the Soviet High Command and reminded them that the only reason they had survived the German onslaught was because the United States had shipped them millions of tons of steel, food, and weaponry. Patton noted, with brutal sarcasm, that it was very easy to boast about the mobility of the Red Army when half of their infantry was riding into Berlin on American-manufactured Studebaker trucks, eating American-manufactured rations. The Soviet translator whispered Patton's words into the ear of the arrogant general. As the translation registered, the blood completely drained from the Russian officer's face. The massive gold medals on his chest seemed to suddenly become very heavy. The Soviet generals were not used to being spoken to in this manner. Within their own totalitarian system, this level of direct, aggressive insubordination to a superior officer was punishable by an immediate bullet to the back of the head. But Patton was not a Soviet subordinate. Patton represented the industrial and military fury of the free world. Patton did not stop there. The psychological dismantling had just begun. The Soviet general had questioned the courage of the American soldier. For Patton, this was the ultimate, unforgivable crime. Patton loved his men with a profound, almost religious fanaticism. To insult the blood they had spilled was to invite Patton's absolute wrath. Patton took a slow, deliberate step away from the table, his hand resting casually near the ivory handle of his iconic revolver. He told the Soviet general that if he ever wanted to test the courage of the American soldier, he did not need to wait. Patton stared straight into the eyes of Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the hero of the Soviet Union, and delivered a threat so massive, so politically catastrophic, that it sent a shockwave of pure panic through the American diplomatic staff. Patton stated, loudly and clearly, that the United States Third Army was currently sitting fully mobilized, heavily armored, and completely victorious just a few miles away. He noted that the Red Army, despite its massive size, was completely exhausted, suffering from catastrophic logistical failures, and entirely reliant on American supply lines that could be severed in an hour. Patton smiled, a terrifying, predatory expression that lacked any warmth. He told the Soviet High Command that he could order his armored divisions to turn east immediately, and his Sherman tanks would drive straight through the exhausted Russian lines and reach the city of Moscow before the winter snow even had a chance to fall. He offered to demonstrate exactly how the American military fights entirely without restraint. The translation hit the Soviet table like an artillery shell. Several Russian generals stood up, their faces flushed with rage and disbelief. Marshal Zhukov remained seated, his face an impenetrable mask of heavy stone, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of genuine shock. Patton was fundamentally threatening to ignite World War III right there in the middle of a dinner party, and the most terrifying aspect of the threat was that every single military professional in the room knew that Patton was absolutely crazy enough and tactically brilliant enough to actually do it. Patton did not fear the Soviet numbers. He despised them. He believed that the great tragedy of the war was that the Allies had stopped at Berlin, instead of continuing east to eradicate the totalitarian nightmare of the Soviet Union. The American diplomats at the adjacent tables were practically hyperventilating. They were desperately whispering to the highest-ranking American military officers, practically begging someone to intervene, to apologize, to drag Patton out of the room before the fragile peace treaty completely collapsed. But the senior American commanders, men who had fought alongside Patton for years, did absolutely nothing. They remained silent. Part of them was horrified by the diplomatic disaster unfolding in front of them, but another quieter part of them agreed with every single word Patton was saying. They had all seen the brutality of the Soviet occupation, and they internally cheered as Patton effectively put a leash on the arrogant Red Bear. Patton did not wait for a fiery Soviet rebuttal. He had delivered his psychological strike, and he had established absolute dominance over the room. The Soviet general who had proposed the insulting toast was standing rigidly, completely humiliated, unsure of how to respond without escalating the situation into a physical confrontation. Patton picked up his untouched glass of vodka from the table. He did not raise it in a toast. He simply tilted it, letting the clear liquid spill out onto the expensive carpet at the feet of the Soviet delegation. It was the ultimate, undeniable gesture of absolute contempt. General George S. Patton turned his back on the Soviet High Command. This was an incredibly dangerous move, an overt display of disrespect, but Patton walked away with the casual confidence of an untouchable warlord. He stalked out of the banquet hall, his heavy boots echoing loudly against the marble floor, leaving behind a room that was fundamentally paralyzed by the terrifying reality of his threat. The doors swung shut behind him, but the massive, suffocating tension inside the hall did not dissipate. Outside the building, the freezing night air of Berlin felt clean compared to the political poison of the banquet. Patton's driver immediately opened the door to the heavy staff car. A young American staff officer, completely pale and trembling slightly from the adrenaline of witnessing the confrontation, ran out of the building after him. The young officer stammered, asking Patton if he had meant what he said, asking if they should actually prepare the Third Army for a confrontation with the Soviets. Patton stopped before getting into the car. He looked out at the dark, shattered ruins of the German capital. He adjusted his polished helmet and looked at the young officer with terrifying clarity. Patton told him that the politicians were blind cowards, and that if they didn't deal with the Russians now, while they had the tanks fueled and the men armed, they would be fighting them for the next 50 years. He ordered the officer to tell the frontline commanders to keep their rifles loaded and the tanks strictly fueled. The war was not over, Patton said. It had only just taken a pause. The morning after the disastrous diplomatic banquet, the American political and military establishment in Europe was in a state of absolute, unmitigated panic. General George S. Patton's terrifying threat to march the United States Third Army directly to Moscow had not been a quiet, private disagreement. It had been broadcasted loudly in front of the most senior military officers of the Soviet Union. The American diplomatic corps, men who had spent years carefully constructing the fragile alliance between Washington and Moscow, were practically hyperventilating. Urgent, highly classified cables were immediately transmitted across the Atlantic Ocean directly to the desk of the President of the United States. The politicians were utterly terrified. Germany had just surrendered. The world was utterly exhausted from the catastrophic loss of human life. The absolute last thing anyone in Washington wanted was a direct military confrontation with the massive, heavily armed Soviet Red Army. But the Soviet reaction to Patton's threat was surprisingly complex. The Soviet High Command filed an intense, furious diplomatic protest regarding Patton's incredibly belligerent behavior. But internally, within the dark, paranoid halls of the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin and his senior generals completely understood the language that Patton was speaking. The Soviet system did not respect polite diplomacy. They respected raw, unadulterated power, and they knew better than anyone else that General Patton was not a politician making empty threats. Patton commanded the most lethal, highly mobile, combat-tested armored force on the face of the planet. The Soviets knew their own logistical lines were stretched to the absolute breaking point. They knew they were heavily reliant on American industrial output. Patton had looked them directly in the eyes and called their bluff, demonstrating a terrifying willingness to use absolute violence to stop their expansion. The Soviet generals hated Patton, but they possessed a profound, undeniable fear of him. The political fallout, however, was impossible to contain. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, was placed in an impossible situation. Eisenhower was an incredibly skilled diplomat. His entire architectural strategy for winning the war had been built upon keeping the fragile alliance together. Patton was his most effective, aggressive weapon on the battlefield, a man who consistently delivered impossible tactical victories. But in the fragile reality of post-war Europe, Patton's aggressive honesty had become an absolute political liability. Eisenhower summoned Patton to a private, highly tense meeting. The contrast between the two men was stark. Eisenhower was thinking about the future of global diplomacy, the establishment of the United Nations, and the complex geopolitical reconstruction of Europe. Patton was thinking only about the undeniable, brutal reality of the enemy standing right in front of him. During the confrontation, Eisenhower severely reprimanded Patton. He ordered him to completely cease any hostile language regarding the Soviet Union. He told Patton that the official policy of the United States government was to maintain peaceful, cooperative relations with the undeniable masters of Eastern Europe. Patton's response was characteristically blunt and completely unapologetic. He told Eisenhower that the politicians in Washington were blind fools playing a pathetic game of tragic appeasement. He argued, with brutal logic, that the Soviet Union was an aggressive, totalitarian empire that would never honor a diplomatic treaty. Patton practically begged Eisenhower to realize that the United States military was currently at the absolute peak of its industrial and combat power. He insisted that if they did not push the Soviet forces back into Russia immediately, while they had the mechanical capability to do so, the United States would spend the next 50 years fighting a devastating, deeply paranoid global war against a communist nightmare. Eisenhower refused to listen. The political pressure from Washington was absolute. They demanded that Patton be silenced. In one of the most tragic, highly controversial betrayals in American military history, General Dwight D. Eisenhower made the decision to strip Patton of his beloved command. The man who had successfully driven American armor across the entire continent of Europe with unprecedented speed, the terrifying warlord who had broken the back of the German military machine, was removed from command of the United States Third Army. He was relegated to a minor, fundamentally irrelevant administrative paper-pushing role involving the demobilization of troops. It was the ultimate, humiliating bureaucratic punishment for a warrior who was entirely incapable of existing in a politically correct environment. The psychological devastation of losing his army was profound. Patton was a man who believed he was entirely destined by God to lead men in battle. Without a war to fight, and without an army to command, he became a restless, alienated figure wandering through the ruins of occupied Germany. He was completely isolated from the political establishment, viewed as a dangerous, unstable relic of a violent past that the politicians were desperately trying to forget. The Soviet generals who had been terrified of him celebrated his removal. The greatest threat to their absolute domination of Eastern Europe had been neutralized, not by Soviet artillery, but by American politicians who were too afraid to acknowledge the terrifying truth of Patton's warnings. The ultimate tragedy of General George S. Patton's life concluded just a few months later. In December of 1945, the man who had survived intense combat in 2 world wars, the general who had stood in the open turrets of tanks while artillery shells exploded around him, was involved in a bizarre, mundane traffic accident. His staff car collided with a military truck on a cold road in occupied Germany. Patton's neck was broken in the crash. He lingered in a military hospital for 12 agonizing days, completely paralyzed from the neck down. For a warrior whose entire identity was built upon relentless physical action and battlefield dominance, it was a horrific, deeply humiliating way to die. General George S. Patton passed away on December 21, 1945. He was buried in a military cemetery in Luxembourg alongside the freezing, muddy American boys who had died serving under his command during the brutal winter of the Battle of the Bulge. The death of General Patton was incredibly convenient for the American diplomatic establishment. They no longer had to worry about the rogue general starting a Third World War with his aggressive rhetoric. But the chilling, undeniable reality of history proved that Patton was entirely correct. Within just a few years of his death, the fragile diplomatic illusion between the United States and the Soviet Union completely shattered. The Soviet Red Army did not withdraw from the territories they had occupied. They brutally crushed any resistance and established a terrifying network of totalitarian satellite states. The Iron Curtain descended exactly where the Soviet tanks had stopped. The Cold War became a reality, dominating global politics for the next half-century and bringing the entire planet to the terrifying edge of nuclear annihilation multiple times. The politicians who had fired Patton and celebrated peace found themselves engaged in a desperate, deeply paranoid struggle against the exact same enemy Patton had warned them about. When American soldiers were freezing in the brutal mountains of Korea and dying in the suffocating jungles of Vietnam, fighting proxy wars against Soviet-backed communist regimes, the ghost of General George S. Patton loomed heavily over the American military. He had stood in that luxurious banquet hall in Berlin, stared straight into the arrogant faces of the Soviet High Command, and offered to solve the problem before it could infect the entire world. He was the only man in the American military establishment brave enough to tell an uncomfortable, terrifying truth. Patton did not care about diplomacy, and he did not care about the delicate sensibilities of politicians. He only cared about winning. And history ultimately vindicated the absolute, terrifying clarity of his vision. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the aggressive, unapologetic reality of General Patton and the intense psychological confrontations of World War II, make sure to hit that like button to feed the algorithm and subscribe to the channel for more dark, untold stories of military history. What do you think about Patton's terrifying threat to the Soviet Union? Did the politicians make a catastrophic mistake by stopping at Berlin? Or was Patton's aggressive strategy too dangerous for a world recovering from a devastating war? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments below, and share this video with anyone who loves real, unfiltered history. We will see you in the next one.